Hi, welcome to the video. Today I'm just going to go through a few ways that we can make rock faces out of styrofoam. So first of all I'm going to cut some shapes of foam core from an old piece of scrap. And I'm just going to make some L shapes that we can attach the stone work to the back of. So, once we've assembled the L shapes out of the foam core, we're going to grab ourselves a piece of styrofoam. Blue kind is generally preferable for this, it seems to hold detail a lot better than the other ones, and you get a decent amount for your money. And we're going to cut several rectangular shapes from the end of it. These are approximately 1 inch across, but it will depend on whatever project you're using them for. So with the first one, we're just going to make some very plain, basic stonework. So we're not going to texture it, we're just going to cut out several small bricks, and we're going to glue them onto the back of the foam core, and there's going to be a very straightforward wall. So just alternating between the brickwork, making some smaller half-size pieces for the edges, and gluing them on using hot glue. For the second piece, we're going to be going for a more roughshod type of stonework, much more rustic looking, and we're going to use a tinfoil ball to roll texture onto it. You can use rock for this as well, whichever you prefer. Oh, if you have a rock lying around, that is. But we're going to cut several different shapes of stone, and we're going to roll the texture onto them. You can be quite firm with this. The more texture you push into them, the better the paint will pick out that detail. And we also want to make sure we round the edges so we have a natural look to them. They don't look like they've been cut stone. So once all our stones have been textured, we're going to attach them to the backboard. And alternating between the different sizes, going between the big ones and the smaller ones. It really pays to have a lot of variation in the stone shapes you originally carved for this. It's very forgiving as well. If you have any gaps like I do, you can just break off an existing piece and use it to plug the gap. For the third type of wall, we're going to be not cutting off individual bricks this time, but we're going to be attaching a larger piece of styrene just to the backboard. And then we're going to take a metal sculpting tool. You could use a knife for this, or a cocktail stick, or whatever you've got around, and we're going to carve the brickwork into the back panel. This is a really good technique for getting straight edges and having nice, neat stonework. Very good for kind of urban buildings or something that's a bit more sophisticated. You can also go in and add cracks and broken bricks. It's a very kind of speedy method you can use. You could use a ruler for this if you wanted absolute straight lines, but I'm just winging it for this bit because it doesn't really matter. This is a great technique for building stonework quickly. Slightly easier to paint as well, because it's not as deep detail. It's also very quick to roll the tinfoil over, because you just mush it into the entire front face of it. So for the fourth type of wall, we're going to grab a thinner piece of styrofoam and we're going to tear it apart with our fingers. This is going to be a much more natural rock face, or perhaps a very rudimentary attempt at stone walling. And we're going to roll the texture into them using the tinfoil ball, rounding out the corners a little. Although we want to retain some of the edges that we got from breaking up. And then glue them onto the backboard. Now if you were smart, you'd use a piece of styrene the same size as the backboard and then replace it in the pattern that you broke it up, but I did not do that. And there we have our fourth wall. So we have 4 different variations of brickwork, and now we're going to apply some base coat to them. So put on your painting glove and get some black gesso and give them a good thick layering. Now gesso is quite a good thing to use for this because it helps to fill the small kind of holes and bubbles on the surface of the styrofoam. It's especially important if you don't roll a texture onto them, because when you do roll a texture it slightly condenses the front face and seals up those holes. But you'll see later that on the one where we didn't roll a texture, there is some visible porousness to the styrofoam. And make sure you get in the cracks here, although not too important because you really can't see that far into them. And once we have the black base coat down, and that's had a few hours to seal and cure, we're going to apply a mid-brown all over the faces of the stonework. And this is going to add kind of earthen base tone to the brick. I'm just using acrylic paints for this, very cheap kind of craft store type. I don't think it's worth using expensive minis paints for this type of thing. Going to add some black and some white, and we're going to mix it up into a dark kind of grey colour. Although we want to mix in a bit of the brown as well, just to tie it closer towards that base coat. We're going to give this a fairly thick layer all over, again helping with the porous nature of it. Now again, painting whatever colour you want your end stonework to look like, this will affect your colours chosen. If you want it to be more slate, you probably go for a dark blue at this point. We're just going to give all the stone faces a nice coat of grey. Now we're going to go over again with a bit of a dry brush, a very kind of pale brown, again using the same brown as we use for the base coat so it all kind of ties together in the same colour range. Now we're going to go very carefully over the top and just pick out some of the details in that stonework. And this is where it really pays off to texture using tin foil or a rock or whatever. Experiment with textures and you get some really, really neat effects. If you want to, you can go over again with an even lighter shade, even just pure white if you want to, and pick out the very, very edge details. Now we get some semi-reasonable looking stone walls. But what we're going to do now is we're going to go in again and fill the gaps between the stonework. This is normally a step that I do before I paint them at all, but I wanted to show what they look like before and after without the gap filling. So on this fourth one especially, that's something that needs a bit of gaps to be filled. So I'm going to push our walls to the side for the moment, and we're going to get an old plastic bag and we're going to pour in. Now you can use whatever flock you want for this, but I'm going to use a finer flock and a slightly coarser one. I believe they're both cork, but I might be wrong on that. We're going to mix them about 50-50 inside the bag. And we're going to add about 1:1 ratio PVA. We're going to seal it up and mix it together inside the bag. You want to make sure it's properly mixed up at this point, and then when you're happy with the consistency, you use a pair of clippers and cut the corner off. So this is very similar to how you'd pipe for a cake or bakery decorations. And we're going to put the nozzle inside the worst of the cracks and squeeze the flock and PVA mixture out inside. This is essentially grouting at this point. And so when you're doing this kind of larger roughshod stonework, it really pays to fill the gaps and makes it look like there is more to sticking the stonework together. You can also use it to tie into the basing if you just have a generic flock on the base. I made too much of the grouting, so I do end up smearing a lot of it on the bases afterwards. And you want to be careful you don't use too much PVA at this point, otherwise you will give everything a glossy kind of finish to the grouting, and it's not preferable. And yeah, I mixed up too much of the paste, so I end up spreading it on the bases and just adding a bit of texture to the floor. And then that blends into the base of the stonework as well. So we're going to give that time to cure. That'll probably take about 24 hours. And then going to hit it with a very kind of watered down black paint. The benefit of this is if we do spill over onto the stonework, we can dab it off with a finger or a paper towel or whatever. Then we're going to mix up, again, the tan colour that we used for highlighting, and we're going to go over the entire thing, hit the grouting and the stonework in a bit of a dry brush, but hitting a bit more paint onto where the grouting is. And this is just going to tie the walls together again. Again, as I said earlier, I normally do the grouting before I paint it at all, so this isn't a step I normally have to do, but for sake of comparison I thought I'd show off what it looks like. And then we have the finished walls. You can see some of them would be a lot better for kind of housing buildings or fortifications. The rough ones great for cave works or cliff sides, or if you have like the edge of a river. But it really just shows kind of the range of stuff you can get an effect with Styrofoam, and I highly recommend that you try out stuff yourself and see what works for you. Thanks for watching, guys. Catch you next time.